Mr. President, thank you for joining Newsmax today. Congratulations on the 10th anniversary of the Clinton Foundation, which you'll be celebrating next month. Tremendous milestone. With CGI underway this week here in New York, I'm wondering if you could reflect a moment on the impact the Clinton Foundation has had on the post-presidency for former presidents like yourself and reshaping the post-presidency, and how the experience of the foundation has changed your life in a personal way.
Well, I think first of all, it's been exceedingly good just to know that you can still make a difference, and that everything I always believed turned out to be true, that private citizens can also do public good, that we can do things that will make a difference. And it's enabled me to work with Bob Dole, for example, who was my opponent in '96. We raised enough money to give college aid to the spouses and children of everybody killed on 9/11 or disabled. With the first President Bush on the tsunami in South Asia and Katrina, the second President Bush in the aftermath of the Haiti earthquake. We just made a loan down there, an investment in new businesses, trying to set up basically a small business investment corporation for Haiti. And all this has been really rewarding to think that, you know, you could just focus on what works and how to do it faster, cheaper, better, and do it. It's been a joy and a little bit of a surprise. If you told me 10 years ago that half the people in the world staying alive on AIDS drugs would have them on our contracts, and that we'd have this Clinton Global Initiative, and that we could document 300 million lives in 170 countries we'd affect, I wouldn't have believed that. It just shows you what people can do if they just think about how to do something instead of how to talk about it and fight about it.
You've grappled with some really serious issues. You just mentioned some of them: disease like AIDS and poverty, sustainable development. The Haiti crisis was a big effort recently. Climate change is at the fore of this particular CGI. Can you give us some insight on why that is, why you're making it important?
Yeah, well, first of all, the world leaders who come from the UN, you know, we always try to respond to our constituents, which are the non-governmental groups, the citizens groups, the business people, and the political leaders that come from the UN. And in next year, the Kyoto Agreement, which was adopted in 1997, early 98, it expires. They've had a meeting in Cancun, Mexico last year. They're about to have one in Durban, South Africa, to figure out what to do next. I have been saying for 10 years, and a lot of people thought I was crazy at the time, that the fundamental problem with climate change is not that it's become a political football in America, not that there's a difference of opinion about it. It's that, take a country that fervently believes that the global warming is going on and that human activity is causing it, but will not support an agreement. China. China is the #1 investor in clean energy technology, the whole 9 yards, and they believe it's real. They think it's going to wreck them. They still won't support an agreement. Why? Because they don't know for sure that a country can get rich, stay rich, and get richer without putting more greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Or to flip it over, they don't know for sure that you could promise to reduce your greenhouse gases and do it in a way that would grow the jobs that you need, grow the businesses that you need. So what I decided to do is to dodge the debate, not because I don't welcome the debate, but because nothing's going to happen in this space until people see that market economies can make profits and generate jobs out of reducing greenhouse gas emissions.
This plays into my next question, which is, when CGI was founded, America, the rest of the world, was in an economic boom. Things have changed dramatically worse. Has this undermined, do you think, the ability of the developed nations to help the underdeveloped nations, and even climate change? You're giving an example, people want to invest the money maybe?
Yes, it's affected it. There's no question that it's affected. If you look at the work I do in Haiti, for example, yesterday we had a meeting of all of our business supporters. Mm-hmm. And we're trying to ramp up the business investments because the government donations are down a little bit because the governments of the world don't have money to honor all their commitments because of the economic crisis. So there's no question it's had an impact on it. But we're still doing well. I mean, heck, we're going to have $6 billion worth of commitments here over a 5 to 10 year period. And they'll affect another 100 million people over and above the people we're already helping. That's pretty good.
The economic crisis, and I know your foundation does a lot of work in the United States. It's not just international. In the inner city, I know you've done stuff for financial literacy, trying to help people bring themselves up. Mayor Bloomberg caused a stir last week, suggesting that if the crisis doesn't improve here, that we could see riots. James Carville, I know you think highly of him. He made some similar comments a few months ago. Yeah. A Republican governor told me privately he worries about civil disturbances. Do you see that as a real threat happening in the United States, as a possibility?
Well, I think there are two issues. The one is the fact that the country has grown markedly more unequal over the last 30 years with minor changes. And this, by the way, this often happens when you change an economic paradigm. As the economy works this way, it tends to settle out. The industrial economy tended to settle out in a way that was very powerful in Europe and the United States and Japan, and create a big middle class and opportunities for poor people to work their way into it, and a successful class of, business and financial leaders. Then we moved to this new thing that Tom Friedman calls a flatter world. And it changes everything, changes the job mix and changes the requirements for doing well in it. And then we have all these debates in America over government. The bottom line is things start growing more unequal again. In general, that has not sparked riots in America. That is, we don't have a lot of resentment against people who are successful. We kind of like it, Americans do. It's one of our best characteristics that if we think someone earned their money fairly, we do not resent their success. And that's why there's been very little class conflict in American history. Now, the second problem is different. The second problem is that it appears that the jobs engine has died on the vine. And a lot of voters, even a lot of young people, they get that companies have $2 trillion, but they're not investing it. They get the banks have more than $2 trillion, they're not investing it. Unless we can find a way to start the jobs engine growing again, it is conceivable that someday we could have some trouble. But I don't think we ought to even think about that. I think we ought to think about how to get the jobs engine going because it's the right thing to do. I wouldn't worry about the other stuff. This is a do-right rule deal. Let's just put America back to work. That's the right thing to do.
You talked about the aspirational ideas of people that want to be successful. They don't dislike successful people who we could also say are wealthy people. President Obama came out with a plan this week that taxes high-income people, the so-called Buffett plan. And the Republicans, House Speaker Boehner, McConnell, the Majority Leader Mitch McConnell have said, no way. So we have two polar opposites now. Do you think that President Obama was smart to come out with a proposal that he knew was just totally unacceptable to the Republicans at a time when the country really is desperate for compromise?
One of the things is this whole thing is a little confusing. Let's try to back it up and unpack it. The speech that the president gave to Congress, he didn't propose any new taxes. The speech the president gave to Congress was $250 billion in tax cuts, $200 billion in spending over a period of 2 or 3 years. And it focused mostly on a rather innovative set of payroll tax cuts and incentives to hire people, particularly veterans and disabled veterans and other people. But it was interesting. Now, I personally don't believe we ought to be raising taxes or cutting spending, either one, until we get this economy off the ground. This has been a dead flat economy, and you don't want, in something this flat, if we cut government spending, which I would normally be inclined to do when the deficit's this big, with interest rates already near zero, you can't get the benefits out of it. So what I'd like to do is to see them come up with a bipartisan approach, and I like starting with the payroll tax cuts because the economic studies show they have the biggest return. And Mark Zandi, who was one of Senator McCain's economic advisors, now works for Moody's. He says if this plan passed, it would add 1.3 to 2% to the GDP growth, somewhere between 1 or 2 million jobs. That's pretty good. And then what I would like to do is to see an effort made at a bipartisan resolution of the banking home mortgage crisis. One of the things that President Reagan did with the Democratic Congress in the early 80s, it never gets any discussion. At least sometimes he gets credit for working with Tip O'Neill for the Social Security fix that took us all the way down here. Never gets any discussion is the way they set up this system to purge the debt overhang from the savings and loan collapse. It was unpopular, but it had to be done. And as soon as we flushed it out, right, there was a big increase in investment, and that gave President Reagan, if you look at the job creation in the Reagan years, first it goes up a little like this, then it drops, and it bumps again. That's flushing the debt from the S&L crisis. So that's what we need to do here with this home deal. And I don't think you can tax or cut taxes. I don't think you can spend or not spend enough to get America back to a full employment economy till we flush that debt. So that's what I'd like. Now, let me give you your point. The timing on this President Obama thing was somewhat confusing because I think everybody's all confused about whether he's proposing all this stuff at once. If you remember Paul Ryan and the Republicans, and Speaker Boehner said, well, the president says he offered us $3 trillion in long-term cuts. This is for the deal they have to make at the beginning of next year. But where is it? Where's the $3 trillion in savings? So what President Obama did with his plan was say, okay, here's the $3 trillion to start the talks with. He knows perfectly well the Republicans aren't going to be for this. But he wanted to prove from just a pure arithmetic thing that here's his $3 trillion. What I would like to say to both Speaker Boehner and to the President, okay, you both have your deal. Go work it out. Meanwhile, focus on putting America back to work now. Because it just confused Americans. Americans lost the fact that whatever you think about this millionaire surcharge, I don't really care because I would pay it, but it won't affect me because I already pay the minimum income because I live in New York. So if anybody lives in New York, because our state and local taxes are so high, and you get to deduct those against your federal taxes, we're already over any threshold anybody can consider. But it's okay with me. I'll pay more, but it won't solve the problem.
You mentioned looking back to the Reagan years and the Elder Bush years, I guess, and the Resolution Trust Corporation, all of that. A lot of people looking back in the 90s, including myself, and saying Bill Clinton showed leadership. He joined with the Republicans' bipartisan effort. You got things accomplished. The economy came where it wasn't only working, it was booming. We had surpluses. Ron Suskind is out with a book this week. He says there's disarray in the Obama White House. They quote some senior aide. He quotes some senior aide saying, Bill Clinton wouldn't have made the same mistakes. If you privately met with President Obama, what would be some actionable advice? I know you could tell him compromise, actionable advice that you would give him to jumpstart the economy and work with the Republicans?
Well, the first thing I'd say is I'd say we need to get a joint plan. I would organize a meeting. There's two big chunks of money in this country, untouched: corporate treasuries and banks. Banks have over $2 trillion in cash uncommitted to loans. Corporate treasuries have $2 trillion uncommitted to investment. But they haven't committed to take it back in compensation either. It's just out there. So the first thing I'd like to see them do is have joint meetings with these people and say, look, just tell us what it takes to get the money flowing again. I mean, if it's not illegal or moral, we ought to do it because that's where the money is. And we don't have to borrow that from China. We don't have to run the deficit up. The money's there. Then I think the other thing that we need to do is there's a real opportunity here for the business community that always considers itself anti-union to cooperate with the unions. You saw today the head of the AFL-CIO is put together a $10 billion plan to invest directly in the private sector to help these buildings finance these retrofits. Now that $10 billion will create approximately 70,000 jobs in the American economy. That's a pretty good pop. That's a good beginning.
People are in the business community are pure frozen. They have the money. The money's on the balance sheets of the banks. It's on the balance sheets of major corporations. They keep saying Obama's not instilling the confidence. And when he comes out and he keeps saying, I want to tax the rich and close corporate loopholes, which comes across as anti-business, is there a way he could message himself better that would unfreeze people?
Well, what I think I don't know what they're saying to him, but what I find is that a lot of business people can be supportive of new regulations and new standards, but particularly in a fragile time, they don't like to have too many things changing at once. I'll give you an example. I talked to a friend of mine who sadly since passed away, but is a very big businessman who happened to be a Democrat. He was a moderate Democrat, and he said, I don't mind most of these changes, but he said it takes time to incorporate them. And he said, you always had a position that you never asked me to do more than one thing at once. He said, a business can't do 5 things at once and decide whether to get back in the investment business after it's slow. So it may be that there's a way, for example, to stagger out when these things are going to be done under the Dodd-Frank bill. Because even if they're all justified, the really important thing about Dodd-Frank that we had to do to establish our financial bona fides again was to have capital requirements on banks and investment banks so we didn't have so much leverage. I think the fact that I signed the deregulation bill didn't have much to do with it. You had banks that failed that had no investment component, but we do have to have some leverage limits. So yeah, that's what I'd like to see done. I'd like to see them, what I'd like to do is if they could do it, I don't know if it's possible now because we're in an election season, but I'd like to see the Republican and Democratic leaders get together with business leaders and with others, anybody who's got money or jobs, and just figure out what it takes to get people to do something. And if it's not illegal or immoral, we ought to do it because this is really an important time for our country.
Well, speaking of the election season, the GOP primary is well underway, very heated. I remember chatting with you well before the 2008 election. McCain was low on the polls. Huckabee was off the radar screen. And you told me McCain's going to come back and Huckabee's going to be a factor. So in looking at your political, I think he has some similarities with you. That you come from the same town. But looking in your psychic political crystal ball, it looks like a Perry versus Romney race. Do you see it that way? And which of those two do you think prevails?
Well, today it sure looks like that's what it is. If you ask who has the power to get back into the mix, assuming no new people enter. I think Mitch Daniels would have been very competitive. I think Haley Barbour would have appeal. I think the governor of New Jersey, Chris Christie, would have appeal. But let's just say, if you assume nobody else gets in, then of those that are there, the question is, can Speaker Gingrich pull what McCain did last time? That is, the one thing that makes it very hard to count him out is he's always thinking. He's always got a bunch of new ideas, and some of them are pretty good. So you got a guy who can still use his brain cells and come up with good ideas. You're never really sure what happens there, and there's no question that Governor Huntsman, because he was governor of Utah, which is a conservative state, speaks fluent Mandarin Chinese, and is and otherwise he has an exemplary public career. There may just not be enough space for him in the ideological bandwidth of a Republican primary. but it's hard to say right now that he would never get anything going. If it stays between Romney and Perry, I think Perry will have the juice of being perceived as the more conservative one. Romney will have the power of being perceived as perhaps more electable because he's more moderate. The Republicans will debate about that, and they'll figure out what to do. I don't know enough about where it is right now to know what will happen. But I predict, I just have this uneasy feeling that politics is not so static that it'll be these two guys fighting it out all the way to the end with nothing unpredictable happening. We just live in a world that's too unpredictable.
Last question. Secretary Clinton, recent poll came out, said she was voted the most favorable political figure on the scene today. I'm sure that made you quite happy.
It did. I think she earned it.
And she's done an incredible job. I think even Republicans agree with that. Hence Dick Cheney's current support for her for president. That must have...
That tickled me, but you know, Vice President Cheney he's a very shrewd fellow. And he knows that, you know, one way to win a race is to sow discord in the ranks of your adversary. So, you know, the way what he said about Hillary made me feel good, but I didn't want to assist him in his political strategy.
But I take at face value Hillary's claim that she's not running in 2012. But what would be the circumstances would you see where she might consider running in 2016?
You know, you'll have to ask her. I just think, I know I sound like a broken record, but when we were kids, and I met her and we started our now nearly, you know, our 40-year plus conversation. I met her 41 years ago this last spring. Pretty quick I decided that she was the ablest person in my generation. And nothing has happened in those 41 years to change my opinion of that. I might have been a better politician, at least at first, on the first go-round. But I never met anybody I thought had the better combination of mind and heart. And so I'm proud, but if she wants to come home, I'll be happy. If she wants to serve, I'll be happy. But she has to decide that. All I know is I'm glad that she's serving now.
Well, Mr. President, I might add that in full disclosure, Newsmax is not unbiased when it comes to you, CGI, and the Clinton Foundation. We fully support the work you're doing. We believe it's bipartisan. It goes beyond the political battle lines, and it's supporting people and doing really tremendous work across the globe. So I want you to know we encourage people to go to theclintonfoundation.org to find out more about it and to join with you.
Thank you. Well, I just like to say, first of all, I thank you for this. And I'd just like to say, kind of as we're on the way out of the interview, you know, my life is so different today than it was when I was in politics. I get support from Republicans and Democrats and conservatives and liberals and people from halfway around the world. And I actually think that these political debates are important, but I think that they're not very helpful in America today because they're all designed basically to push us away from each other. Instead of for me to figure out what you know that I don't know and what I might know you don't know and how we can get something done. And if you really look at what works in the world today, look at all these places in America that are booming. Near you, look at Orlando. 100 simulation companies. What's the model? The model that works is cooperation. Everybody kicks in what they're good at. The model that works in politics is conflict. And one of the things that I wish I could figure out how to do is how to make the model that works in real life be more effective in politics. Not because I don't think there should be liberal conservative debates. I do. There's a lot of space for debate, but it bothers me that our politics is so disconnected from what's working in real life, and that's what I try to do here.
Well, you're setting a great example, and I appreciate your time and your work.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President.